Good day to you. Big data. Big data. What a cool expression, right? Like, how can something that seems to be so abstract, data, of which the singular form is datum, how can that be big? How can it be small? Isn't it intriguing to think about where this term comes from? And that's what we're exploring today. And actually, what we're doing is we're starting some of this mind blowing stuff behind a political, economic analysis of social media today. The mind blowing stuff, as you will see when you get into this chapter, you don't have to agree with this book in all places or any places if you want, but this kind of alternative thinking is really the central point of this book, that we're not introduced to this kind of thinking because our society is a society of big data capitalism. And capitalism rejects this kind of thinking. We're going to start to get into these terms today. We're going to have a lot of repetition of these terms in this course. So don't feel as they're coming out today that they are vanishing after this. And if you didn't get it, you're not going to get it. It's not true. A lot of repetition is needed in the study of political and economic analyses of social media and all forms of political and economic analyses, not just of social media. Yeah, political economy is practiced in other areas of the academy as well. So let's start off with a basic question. What is big data? What is big data? It's really things are being done at the largest scale possible, like way beyond our normal parts and structures and pieces and infrastructures. Way beyond that, it's something that's so big and comprehensive. It's like comparing, what would you say, multiple universes to just the Earth's atmosphere. That's what big data is. And it involves cloud computing, which is essentially the storage of that big data that's out there, this mass that's so big that you can't even wrap your head around it. That's what big data is. Which takes us now to big data capitalism. Big data capitalism is digital capitalism. It's using computers and the codification of thoughts and actions into ones and zeros. It's digital capitalism, or the accumulation of capital and power through digital means. The accumulation of capital and power. Capital is money, but it's also stocks, it's buildings, it's resources, it's personnel. Capital are all of these things together that help make a company profitable. That's what we refer to when we refer to capital. And capital accumulation, like Pac-Man or Pac-Woman, is what capitalism is always driving to do. And along with that comes power, because the people that have more capital accumulation, the people who are more wealthy, they tend to have more power. In the digital world, what makes it different and where big data plays a big role is that the accumulation of power and of capital is done primarily through algorithms, through mathematical formulas that human beings are only in charge of designing, and then after that, the algorithms are making the decisions. And this, furthermore, is being conducted in what Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher, called a surveillance society. We're going to talk a lot about surveillance in this class and being surveyed. A surveillance society is an important part of big data capitalism. It is a big moneymaker, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later today. Also, in big data capitalism, you have what Shoshana Zuboff calls a society dominated by the exploitation of the working class. You have a society dominated by the exploitation of the working class. Now you're starting to get classic Marxist theory, but wait till you find out who the workers is. It's not people in factories, it's you, it's me, and it's everybody who types a single keystroke on the computer. This argument will take a while to develop in this class. We have such institutions that try and address this digital divide, if you want to think of it that way, big data capitalism, as it is not equal across the world. One of them is called the International Division of Digital Labor, finding that people in China working in digital fields are earning a lot less than people working in the United States, and that's unfair. And so that's why you have a division of digital labor. Capitalism, then, as Fuchs is trying to get across by the time you get to the end of the section, is more than just one tiny little piece. It's like big data in of itself. Capitalism is many different capitalisms that make up the big C capitalism, and that's going to take a while to unpack. A central component of all capitalism, Marx says, is that you have two kinds of capital that are generated. Remember, capital accumulation is what capitalism is all about. And Marx says you've got constant capital. Constant capital is the economic value of the materials that are used to make them commodities. the economic value of the materials used to make the commodities. So when you have a cell phone, you've got glass in there, right? And you've got plastic and you've got batteries, right? Those all have value. Okay, the value is constant though because the price of those is relatively fixed. You may have inflation, but it's relatively fixed once you lock into a pricing structure to purchase glass for your iPhone, if you're a manufacturer. Compare that to variable capital. Variable capital is the wages that are paid to employees. And those wages are depressed as much as possible by corporations so that the profits are greater. We're going to learn about that later. Wages are depressed as much as possible. That's why they are variable. In times where, like right now, where workers are in shortage, actually wages are much higher because employers are having a hard time finding people. Now let's move on to the idea of big data's political economy. Big data's political economy. What we're doing when we're using that phrase political economy is we're really talking about the intersection of politics and economics and digital capitalism. And that's sort of the framework that this overall book is based on. The heavy theoretical framework is politics and economics. Going along with this is a term that's from Marx's original writings and was also used by Dwight D. Eisenhower, of all people, President of the United States. And it was called originally the military-industrial complex. And it was about a money-making machine out there that was so far ahead in perpetuating itself to make weapons and guns and airplanes for the military, which would then have unlimited supplies of money from the government to purchase it. That's what the original term came about as. But now that term is being used to describe a military-industrial corporate complex. And what that's all about is you have surveillance that I said that's going on, but the surveillance is used by the military, it's used by government, it's used by CVS, it's used by an ATM that you go to, it's used by a doorbell when you go over to somebody's house, it's used by somebody's camera that they have outside. We live in a surveillance society. That kind of service and the products and commodities, well, commodities are products, they're things that you purchase, that go along with security, the cameras and the subscriptions that you have to pay, those are huge money-making operations. So the surveillance society is not just about keeping us safe, and we'll even discuss whether they do that. It's also about this huge component of our money-making economy, the politics and the economics of a surveillance society. Now, you will hear a term called neoliberalism that's going to be used throughout this book, and that word liberal itself has unfortunately gone through a lot of different redefinitions, and today it's mostly considered to be a person who's free with money and taxes and doesn't have a lot of moral standards, a person who's weak. Those are the kind of, shall we say, denotations that go along connotations, the associations that go along with how we think of liberalism. But the term actually has a classic definition. Neoliberalism basically means a market-based economy. That's what it means. It means a freedom from government. That's what new liberalism is, a different kind of freedom from previous freedoms. Neoliberalism is a freedom from government interference in the economy. That, strictly speaking, is what it's all about. But what people don't realize often when they talk about let the market decide, supply and demand, is that a market fundamentalist ideology is at play there. And a market fundamentalist ideology, or way of looking at the world, that's what an ideology is, and a fundamentalist ideology means it's basic, also means that neoliberalism is a form of government that regulates the economy. It is a form of government that regulates the economy. Facebook can put you in jail, so to speak. And that's regulating your behavior on Facebook, even though it's not a state government agency or a federal government agency that can suspend you or, quote, put you in jail. It's a corporation that can do that. And so that's sort of the paradox that goes around. We think of neoliberalism and free market capitalism as it's just free and it's devoid of any kind of influence. It's not. So neoliberalism organizes as many societal realms as possible into commodity-selling corporations. As much as possible. So utility services that you get, electricity, make them money makers. Nursing homes, make them money makers. Healthcare, make it a money maker. Now, these are not necessarily money makers in other countries. So there are alternative ways of approaching the organization of these institutions, but the point is, in a neoliberal society, of which the United States is one and Japan is another, is there is the kind of compressing of profit-making entities into as many realms of society as possible. Within this context, big data targets and monitors users as prosumers. So you're constantly being not only monitored, but you're being targeted. And that's why your news feed and everything else that you're looking at on social media is littered with advertisements that seem to have an uncanny resemblance to something that you were just searching for on Amazon or something that you just mentioned in front of Alexa, because you're being collected on all the time, that big data. So really the population as a whole, the whole population of the United States and really any country is subject to big data capture. It's trying to, the corporations that are controlling the digital complex, they're trying to totally capture people in terms of data. And there's a term that's been resurrected to describe this. It's called data colonialism. You know what colonialism was, right? It was when Spain and France and Holland and the UK sailed around the world and conquered people and used slaves to do that, in many cases for trading. And is, the kind of thing that we like to look back on and say, I hope that never happens again. But there's a new kind of digital colonialism that's going on, and it's a conversion of human life into data. It's making decisions about real people using algorithms and converting them into very simple ones and zeros. So capitalism actually has an imperialistic and colonialist dimension to it. It tries to gobble up new territory. Certainly Facebook was not content, or Twitter, or Snapchat, or Instagram, or TikTok to stay in the country they were designed in. TikTok is a Chinese company, right? It explodes to other parts of the world, and that's where the colonial part of digitalization comes in. Now, Facebook offers a service that on the outside appears to be very helpful to developing countries. It's a service called Free Basics. And it basically says that any countries that are developing can get onto Facebook and use email for free. But what that's really doing, Fuchs is arguing, is it's extending big data capitalism to other countries, and particularly from northern countries to southern countries and western countries to eastern countries. Excuse me, the north tends to be more wealthy, and the east tends to be more wealthy. The west tends to be more wealthy than the east. Now let's start to talk about big data's capitalism's problems, the problems with big data capitalism. First of all, the ideology of big data capitalism makes big data a positive experience. And when I use positive, I do not mean positive versus negative. I mean positivity in terms of social sciences, a mathematical way of reasoning. That's what positivity is. Have you ever heard positivity science? That's what it's all about. And even the term is not at all trying to cloak that it's biased towards using data to describe human beings. And so there's a significant value for the world economy, is what many corporations argue. They're arguing that really big data presents opportunities and resources for people, and the ability for people to basically be consumers, right? But what is not being talked about, and it's a problem with big data capitalism, is there is a consumer culture that's been created that is not necessarily good for us. It's where you're trying to make the world essentially a giant shopping mall, and people are racking up thousands of dollars on their credit cards and purchasing things that they can't afford on a daily basis, and buying things that they don't really want, like fast food, but they can't help but do what other people are doing, and buying things when they're depressed to try and get out of their depression, all the things that go along with being a consumer. And within this, wages were increased for workers to buy more commodities. And so the cycle perpetuates itself. When we get more money, we want to buy more things. Also going along with the problem of big data is entertainment has become a way of life. Entertainment has become something that we want to do in the evening rather than gain insight into a problem. Now I'm speaking very sweepingly, right? But we generally will put on a sitcom, for example, or we'll watch a Netflix movie that's a Marvel comics or a Marvel film full of special effects and over the top. Entertainment is a way of life. We follow the Kardashians. We follow Britney Spears, what's going on. We follow any celebrity, really, Drake, all of them. What's Kanye saying about Kim Kardashian? We want to know this, right? It's part of the problems of big data capitalism, taking our eye off the ball of what's really going on with exploited workers. Again, it's going to take the book to be able to develop this concept in full.
Also, a big problem with big data is instrumental reason. Instrumental reason is where algorithms are calculating, planning, and monitoring our human needs. Not humans, algorithms are. And really think about what they're monitoring with your Fitbit and everything else that you're having that's digital. The algorithms are monitoring your sleep, your body, the steps you take every day, the movements, the locations you go to, even your moods. Even your moods. People constantly use that expression on Facebook, current mood, and then they'll post a meme. You're just providing big data about your emotions. And yes, another problem with big data is inequality. Inequality because commodification can spread that inequality across different populations because there will be new forms of discrimination. And these new forms of discrimination are basically using rational positivistic reasoning rather than philosophy and ethics and really the liberal arts, which is what universities are supposed to provide. That's what makes them different from community colleges. You have a liberal arts education. And so the inequality is being pressed because we are reasoning not through studying human needs and human expressions and human emotions, but rather human purchasing patterns. Also, we have surveillance capitalism. That's another problem with big data capitalism, surveillance capitalism, which I alluded to earlier. So we've got Alexa, we've got IP addresses, we've got security cameras. You're really not able to make a move these days without being seen unless you go off the radar. There's a really cool part of West Virginia where they have a Navy telescope that's an acoustic telescope. And that means it's looking out into the universe and it's studying the universe by bouncing sounds and then retrieving those sounds and studies the size of planets. That's the way this telescope works. But they can't have any electrical signals. Not even cars with spark plugs can drive next to this facility. So the whole area is blacked out. So what West Virginia does is it markets it as an off-the-grid, off-the-radar vacation destination where you can get away from all of this constant surveillance that's going on. Basically, though, the premise of surveillance is there's a categorical suspicion that everyone is a potential terrorist. Otherwise, we wouldn't need such widespread and that's a decision that's made by algorithms, not by human beings, right? Yet another problem. Excuse me one moment. Yet another problem with big data capitalism is the increase of unemployment because big data is often outsourced. You will have companies in the United States that say, why should we pay our employees to calculate payroll by looking at the salaries, by grabbing the data on hourly wages, when this company in the Philippines will do it for half the cost? And so American workers lose their jobs. Now, any good criticism always involves providing alternatives. You cannot stop here and say, oh, it's all bad, right? What are the alternatives? And so Christian Fuchs starts to do this. There will be other parts in the book that do this as well. So one of them is a recommendation by Bunce and Meikle to researchers who suggest that there should be a flight mode for digital media. A flight mode where you can still connect to the internet, but there's a block from companies being able to extract that big data from you. It's an interesting concept. Like when you put your phone on flight mode, right? You can still look at the content and it's not going to interfere with the pilots. Hope I can make it to the end here. One more sip. The pilot's communication. Another alternative is what's known as commoning or commonism, which is not communism. That's not what we're talking about here, okay? Commonism. Commonism is more sharing, less of you have to pay for this to get it, more voluntarily sharing things. That's really what Facebook is supposedly all about, but we'll get into the sharing economy later on. Yeah, that's what it's called. Another way to look at commoning is socialism. We'll flat out say socialism. Yes, that's another term that is outside the bounds of acceptability for capitalism. We understand that. We understand that when you mention socialism, it's automatically supposed to be seen as bad or evil, but we're going to study it from an academic standpoint in this class, and one of the central features of it is commonism. And that is allowing platforms that are social media to be provided for by the government that are not profit-making platforms. We'll talk more later about what commonism involves. Big data commonism, just to make one final comment, seeks to limit that storage that goes on in the big data world. Don't make it more and more needs for storing. Try and limit that storage so that less is out there. And finally, we have an alternative of platform cooperatives. These are social media platforms that are not for profit. Are there any that are out there? I'll give you a few minutes, right? You can't come up with one, right? We're going to discuss what that will look like by the end of the book. All right, other alternatives is we've got critical digital modes. And so what that means is right now, the way that our society is organized, we've already mentioned, is by algorithms, but that's also saying that as a discipline of study, computer science is colonizing the social sciences and the humanities, because computer science is the basis for digitization. And the writing of all these rules for how you even put a web page together or anything that's content on the internet, you need computer science to be able to do that and all the computer science languages. But computer science has an ideology, and it is not looking at really big questions like ethics, questions about human beings and how they've developed and how they've been repressed and oppressed, and political power struggles. That's what political science is for and history is for. So critical digital modes is a problem that can be rectified by more of a place of philosophy in deciding how social media should be administered. And that also goes true for theory. Theory in a digital world, in a digital capitalism world, is de-emphasized. Theory is reduced to small definitions of things. It's not thought of as the big way of understanding the world. And that's what theory is all about, is to speculate, but to speculate in an educated fashion so that you can learn about the world. And maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, but you're pushing yourself to try and understand it more. You need to have an academic basis to be able to do that with depth. That's what this book is about, right? It's almost all theory. It's already probably pressing your mind. I hope it's blowing your mind in many ways. You can't do that with computer science. You need philosophy. You need the liberal arts. You need communication as a field. And finally, you need critical digital research. Critical digital research is focusing on that concept of digital and how digital organizes our theorizing. How the digital world organizes our theorizing. Even today in academia, if you publish an article, it's different from when I first started publishing articles in academia, because today your article is going to be measured by the number of hits that it receives in databases and libraries across the United States. That's a great example of a digital theory driving what is supposedly the popularity or the specialness of the article. And it doesn't mean anything, right? You could have friends that are hitting that button. You could have people that are hitting hitting the link for your article thinking it was an article about something else. So it's an example of how we need critical digital research, taking that concept of digital and really examining how it biases our thought process. So there you have it. A lot of things to consider today in this world that we live in. It's a world of big data capitalism. Have a great day.